Hi, greetings from a slowly darkening January afternoon in Warsaw. I hope that you are all doing well and are enjoying your start to 2025. So in this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I'm hopeful, I suppose, for 2025. And as I talk about that, I went on a trip to Krakow recently, so I'll be overlaying some of the videos from Krakow that I made whilst I was there for your enjoyment whilst we go. Goodness, it's really cold today. It's about -5 degrees, and as you can see, we've had a little bit of snow here as well. Not a lot, but it's enough to make the place look a little bit nicer. I guess a little dusting of snow always makes things look a little bit more romantic. So what do I mean anyway when I talk about being hopeful for the future? Well, I think one of the reasons why a lot of people are feeling a bit pessimistic is because of the prevailing attitudes of people, not just online but in the wider world. We see so many things in the cultural narrative these days are not just about trans people, but about people of all different shapes and forms and backgrounds and contexts and colours. And that can make us feel quite apprehensive about what's to come. I try to feel a little bit less worried about these things because I've experienced look at these doggies, because I've experienced a few things in my past which I'm slightly less than proud of, but it suggests a fact that perhaps people who are stuck in these kinds of mindsets aren't necessarily there permanently, that there are ways to get people out of this. It just takes a bit of time, patience and perseverance to do so. Let's rewind the clock to something like 2014. So we're talking quite a long time ago now. And I don't know if any of you were around or part of the YouTube, I don't know what you call them, community back then, but around about then, 2014, 2015, YouTube slightly tweaked their algorithms such that you would be recommended certain types of videos. And these were the sorts of videos where there was much more attention being paid by the algorithm to the E word. And by E word, I mean engagement. So they were looking at recommending videos that would have people watching for longer, but also they started to really ramp up the importance of videos which would get people liking, maybe commenting, definitely sharing. And so as we've seen how the algorithms tend to work, that seems to promote a certain type of video or certain type of content, shall we say, because the same sort of things copied or replicated on places like Facebook. So what did that mean for me and my YouTube feed? Well, suddenly, out of nowhere, I was being recommended longer form videos by people who are making more kind of video essay type things. And I'm sure you know the type of content that I'm talking about. But back then there was one main purveyor of this type of video, and these tended to be the what they called themselves skeptics. And they started off with making videos more about atheism, and they focused, or at least they claimed to be focusing on things like rational, scientific, logical thinking. And so obviously atheism was very much part of that. And so they would make videos where they'd be basically dunking on religious folk and critiquing various arguments in favour of being religious. And so far, so harmless, I suppose. At the time, and I still am very much in the kind of atheist camp, so most of that content I would tend to agree with. But then it seemed to branch out to other things as well, and they started looking for other avenues of criticism. And eventually, I know around then, there was the whole Gamergate stuff going on as well, which hopefully you don't know about, because that was a particularly awful part of internet culture. But this was very much a kind of anti-feminist kind of period, where you'd get a lot of content which would be criticizing feminism and all of that sort of thing. And I have to say, I fell down that rabbit hole quite hard. I would be watching these videos with a certain degree of pleasure, these longer form 30-40 minute long videos where they'd be talking about how feminism is the evil of all society. And I didn't necessarily agree with that, to be honest. But what I did agree with was this sort of cynical, very bitter sort of perspective of the world in general. And at that time, I was a very angry person. I was very unhappy because I was in a relationship and marriage where I wasn't happy. I was in a body that I was increasingly unhappy with. I was very, very closeted, although I was becoming increasingly aware that I am transgender. And so that sort of cynicism and anger in those videos really appealed to me, because I felt just as angry, I felt just as unhappy as those people seemed to do as well. And the thing is I didn't necessarily disagree with the starting point of a lot of these videos either. That there's something, first of all, deeply wrong with society, which I still do believe, and that young men, especially young white men, are often maligned in culture, and they're not necessarily getting a lot of support that is needed, especially when it comes to things like mental health support. And I still strongly believe this. I still think that men, especially young white men, they're looking for support from somewhere, and they're not necessarily getting it in the right places, which is why the likes of Andrew Tate and stuff are gaining traction with this demographic, because they're looking for something, but they're finding it in the wrong places. There's something incredibly appealing about somebody who's telling you that you're fine and that there's nothing wrong with you, but the problem lies over there. And I think that's the conclusion that these people tend to draw that is misplaced. The issue with it that a lot of young white, especially, but also black males are facing, it's a wider cultural issue. You can't place all of the blame for this at the feet of feminism, but that was the general conclusion that a lot of these commenters were making, because feminism's a relatively easy target. So yes, that's where they were coming from. So yeah, that's how I would while away my time after work. I'd be consuming these videos, enjoying them because they were funny. They felt to me pretty well researched. They'd obviously put in a lot of effort into creating them, and they were saying things which actually I hadn't really heard before, in a way that I hadn't really heard. It was very user-friendly, let's say, and very accessible, and they used the kind of language because, as I say, they were coming from that sort of skeptical / atheistic mindset that felt logical. So why am I saying this in a kind of a hopeful way? Well, because at one point they made a mistake. So what did they do? Well, I was watching a video, and as I say, they were coming from these very cynical kinds of places, and they'd covered religion, they'd covered feminism, and then they started to cover multiculturalism, and they would create videos about how immigrants and immigration was a bad thing, and how this was something which was a net negative for particular cultures. Now the problem is, I grew up in a part of London which is incredibly multicultural, and while it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, I'm incredibly proud that I grew up there. I think the fact that I grew up around people and faces and voices from different backgrounds and different cultures, be that first, second, third generation immigrants, I think that was an absolute positive for me and for the area that I grew up in. I think that was a really, really useful part of my education. And so hearing their arguments against multiculturalism certainly triggered a kind of a skepticism in me about their videos. And the other mistake they made is that they tended to make these response videos to the liberal loonies on the other side of the debate. And so I was increasingly exposed to what I guess we could call breadtubers. I don't know if that's still part of the lexicon these days, but the likes of H. Guy and Sean. And eventually through them I found ContraPoints and Philosophy Tube. And through being exposed to people on the so-called other side of the argument, I realized how close I was to becoming the sort of person that I really despised. Because I'm not a right-wing lunatic, far from it. But I could feel the more of those videos I watched, the more extreme my views became, the more I might find my head nodding along to arguments about why women were going to bring about the downfall of society. Because if that's what you're being exposed to, and if that's what you're being surrounded by, you might find that that starts to infect your mindset. But bit by bit, as I watched some of the people on the other, and I hate using this two sides metaphor, but I mean that's basically what it was, the more they pulled me out of that attitude, because the more of myself I saw within those voices, the more I found I would agree with what they had to say. And also, beyond that, it just felt like the right type of attitude to have. Like, let's take the idea and concept that all of womanhood is some kind of drain on humanity. Well, that's a ludicrous starting point, because they take up more than 50% of the population of the world. So if they're the problem, then surely humanity at large has a problem, and I don't really believe that. I think there are pockets of humanity which cause problems, but you can't point the finger at an entire demographic. So the more I thought about it, and the more I watched both sides of this debate, the more I ended up landing with what I perceive, obviously, as the more acceptable side. Now, I'm pretty sure you can see where I'm going with this, because through this experience I've had, I can absolutely understand how anybody could fall down that rabbit hole of extremism and hatred and suspicion and all of that, just picking at an already existing sense of unhappiness and malaise by there's having a start point of there's something wrong with the world. I think a lot of people can absolutely get on board with that. I think that this is a mindset and attitude that pervades so much of the world today, because there is a lot of shit going on in the world. There's a lot of reasons for people to be unhappy. But the fact of the matter is, one side of these sides again, one group of voices tries to find or seems to suggest that the answers to this are really simple. And that's incredibly appealing, because the alternative of things being incredibly complicated and difficult to fix, it's a very unappealing thought. That's really that makes the thought of trying to fix these things feel like an impossibility. So it's an incredibly attractive proposition when somebody can say, look, here's the problem, and it's got a fairly simple solution. But you can absolutely get somebody away from that perspective, and I'm evidence of that. I feel that I've made that journey myself, although it did take a lot of time. So I'm hopeful that even though there's so much hatred and impatience and anger and suspicion in the world, I absolutely think that we can move towards a world where people are a lot more open and considerate to each other. But it takes a lot of time, and the solutions to this are not simple. You know, I had to be exposed bit by bit to different types of voices that already corresponded to a kind of mindset that I already had. If you're trying to break somebody out of that toxic kind of thinking, it takes a lot. It takes a lot, and you need to be persistent and consistent, welcoming and positive, I suppose. And also understanding that their start point might be from a very different place as yours. And that's incredibly hard. Even I don't have that type of patience, to be honest. So I think it's beyond me. But I'm sure that there are some people out there who can do that. And I know, because I was exposed to those voices myself. So yeah, this is why I remain hopeful, because I think we can get there. I think that this can only last so long. Hatred has a shelf life, in my view, and I'm hoping that we're coming to that expiry date, but we'll see. 2025, there's a long way still to go here. There's a lot of stuff to do, a lot of ground to cover, but I know that most of us will still be here this time next year, so we'll see how accurate my predictions are, won't we? Anyway, so that's kind of floating around in my head. As you can see, it's getting darker and darker, so I'm going to say good night. But all the best, take care. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed my scenes in Krakow. Take care, bye-bye.